Hi, Persis. Welcome to T.E.A.R Talk for the month of June, Pride Month. We're so excited to have you here. Thanks for coming.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
It's my pleasure. So I just want to start off by asking you, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your podcast?
For sure. So I'm Persis. I'm a 27-year-old femme, gay Indian woman. And I started my podcast, Girl on Girl, about 2 years ago now, which is wild to think about. Started it kind of in pandemic times with my old co-host slash roommate who I lived with for 8 years. But the whole premise of the podcast is basically taking her straight perspective and my gay perspective and coming together to talk about taboos, labels, pop culture. We talk about queer icons and also just our own dating lives because it's kind of fun to get that perspective too. And I don't feel like in queer media specifically, we see a lot of the straight perspective. I mean, there's a lot of queer podcasts out there and of course like hetero podcasts, but we're like, when do you get like a gay girl and a straight girl who are best friends to just like chat it out and gossip? And we call it kind of like our wine living room chats just on a public platform. But we've managed to get some cool guests on the podcast as well, like Fifi Dobson we had on. We had a Netflix actor, Umberly Gonzalez, Kira Graves, who's pretty popular on YouTube, and an actor as well. So I don't know, we've really expanded it to something special and it means a lot to me.
Yeah, definitely. And I've heard the podcast and it's so interesting. There's so many really cool people that have been on and some really interesting conversations, especially when you combine both perspectives together. And one of the big issues that we really see, and I think one of the big issues that Pride Month aims to combat, one is to really celebrate, the 2S LGBTQ plus community. But one of the issues that it really aims to combat is structural discrimination against 2S LGBTQ plus people. Would you mind telling me a little bit about that?
For sure. So looking into structural discrimination is definitely like any discrimination towards like the characteristics of someone. So, their race, how they identify, how they, present themselves in the world. And that's kind of all about what the LGBTQIA+++ community is about, right? It's about showing up as yourself and being authentic. And it takes a lot of that courage, especially when you grow up in such a heteronormative society. There's a lot of unlearning you have to do. So that's kind of where that discrimination occurs. It's people who identify with how they feel, who they are in their soul, but also things you can't control, right? Like your race. It's just sad all around, but I feel like the queer community really gets it as well.
For sure.
Yeah.
And how does that structural discrimination that takes place in so many of these different spaces, whether it be at workplaces or schools, in the healthcare setting, how do you feel structural discrimination really leads to gender-based violence?
That's a really good question. And I think the way, and I hope this makes sense when I say it, but I do feel like it's a bit of a domino effect, kind of like how something can start in one way, discriminating against someone's race, and then it just leads into more. So their gender, how they identify, their sexual orientation, how they show up in the world. I just see it, it's kind of like it starts with one thing and then it becomes this domino effect of something even bigger. And I think we see that in a lot of different scenarios. Totally.
And I think what's really important as well is that you touched on the intersecting identities that various different people have.
Yeah.
So, it's not just sexual orientation or your gender, it's also, your race. It could be other factors that really come together to really determine what somebody's experience might look like when it comes to all those different forms of discrimination. So what are some ways that, a person who, isn't one of those identities can actually be an effective ally to the 2S LGBTQ plus community?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's sometimes very easy to say, I'm an ally, like I support the queer community. And it's one thing to say it, but to actually show up with like these tangible efforts, I think is really important. And just a really good example of that, and I've been learning about allyship through my co-host, Sarah, I'll give her a shout out, who identifies as straight and is hosting a gay podcast, which is amazing. But it is about like listening to the stories of queer people. I think first and foremost, being really open-minded to hearing what they have to say, giving them that space. Consuming queer media, I think, is very important. Opening up the conversation with friends and family who maybe, family especially, I think, who grew up in a different generation. It's good to kind of talk to them about the queer community and also challenge those stereotypes. I mean, I've had to do that with some of my extended Indian family. And I feel like the more we challenge stereotypes, there hopefully could lead to less like discrimination, because people don't have this like perception of what gay looks like, because it doesn't look like anything to be gay. You're just you. Or to LGBTQI plus community, you're just showing up as you. And I think the stereotypes, we gotta smash that.
Do you have any tips for having these tough conversations, perhaps with family members or with friends or even coworkers that really work to challenge stereotypes? And that's not to say that it's only on the 2S LGBTQ plus community to have these conversations. You know, it falls to everybody, especially those who are allies as well. Do you have some tips on how can one potentially have those conversations?
Yeah, I feel like always approaching it in a way with kindness is a good way, and wanting to, I guess, making that other person feel comfortable that they can have that open conversation with you and you're not coming at them heated with judgment. Because I've done that. I've sometimes been so defensive to be like, why don't you understand? But I think it's really important to go in with like an open mind, and they'll feel comfortable to have those conversations, because it can be really uncomfortable for people. You know, they're kind of stuck in their own little bubbles, and that's what's safe to them. But I love having those conversations and challenging people and really opening up their eyes to just how people are. So actually, it's awesome that you bring up this question, because I had a guest on my podcast a couple months ago at this point, but her name is Lauren Abedini, and she's a lesbian DJ in LA and someone I've really admired for so long. And she actually says she thinks approaching with strategy is really smart. And I never really thought of it in that way. But if you can be strategic in the way you approach your conversation with someone, I think it leaves like less room for aggression, and you want to feel safe too, right? So yeah, approaching something with strategy and kindness and openness.
Totally. And I think that's really important, what you said about approaching with strategy. I think it's also challenging sometimes as well when it's your identity and somebody's questioning that, you know, that can be really tough. So, you know, the frustration is super understandable, but I think definitely some really important strategies on maybe how to, you know, think about a little bit more strategically, maybe ways we can have these conversations. And once again, just encouraging people that would consider themselves allies to take on the emotional labor of having those really difficult conversations. And, you know, just to kind of, I think all of this is really important advice. And just to kind of close off the conversation, I want to ask you, what are you getting up to for this Pride Month?
Oh, I'm so excited. I mean, I feel like it's Pride every day for me, honestly, as like an out lesbian living her life. But I specifically want to go to the parade for sure. I want to go to as many queer events as I can and support my friends in the community. I'll be celebrating with my girlfriend this year too, which will be really nice, and my friends, and going to drag shows. I want to go to as many drag shows as I possibly can and dance.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I'm so excited to hear that. It sounds like it's going to be a really exciting and fun month for you. I wish you the happiest Pride Month, and thank you so much again for coming on, sharing your knowledge with us, and helping us learn and grow.
Of course. Thank you for having me.